This next panel is going to be run by Sara Fischer of AXIOS. Few months back, I walked into a room and I heard somebody talking about the dangers that concentrated power poses to American journalism. And I said, who is this person? And I came around the corner and it was Sara Fischer. So I thought that was, it's a great honor to have her here today. As soon as we knew we were going to handle this or host this event today, I said I'd need to get Sara Fischer up on a panel. AXIOS as an organization has been doing a great job. Sara's actually fighting concentration of power, shining a light on it. Sara's colleague, Jim Vandehei there, recently published an article in which he wrote, "Google is a gigantic octopus with sprawling, growing tentacles reaching deep into every nook and crevice of media companies." So it's not always easy to find people who are willing to stand up and talk about this issue, especially people who are subject to these powers. It is a great honor to have Sara here today, and I'll leave her with the panel.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to everyone who's joining us here today. I think everybody in the room has a like-minded passion for this topic, and I'm excited to be a part of it. I'd like to introduce some of the panelists that we have here. It is truly an all-star team that we have to talk today about the current situation that we're in funding quality news and information in the United States. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce everyone, and then we're going to kick it off to Jason, who's just going to set the scene a little bit before we start. So to my direct left, we have Jason Kint, who's the CEO of Digital Content Next, which is a digital publishing association. If you don't know Jason, Jason has been one of the most vocal people about what the rise of powers like Google and Facebook are doing to the news and publishing industries. He and many other trade associations recently authored a letter to Facebook trying to negotiate better terms for how their content is going to be archived on the platform. This is an example of one of the many things that Jason does to help news organizations fight for better monetization and better power within the ecosystem. To Jason's left, we have Lina Khan. Lina is the author of Amazon's Paradox and the director of legal policy at Open Markets Institute. She's considered a foremost thinker on all things open markets. I had the pleasure of sitting on a panel with her at South by Southwest, and I learned a lot from her there. To Lina's left, we have Ben Smith, the editor-in-chief of Buzzfeed News. He'll walk us through how an organization, a digitally first organization, is combating some of these challenges. And he has experience working for some legacy news organizations, so he can explain how things have evolved. To Ben's immediate left, we have Julia Angwin, the author of Dragnet Nation and a former senior reporter at ProPublica. Julia will be able to walk us through everything that is evolving in this news ecosystem, how reporters and readers and editors are all changing due to the market powers that be. And then finally, to the left of Julia, we have Jonathan Kanter, an antitrust attorney who will talk to us about news economics, advertising economics, etc. So with that, Jason, if you would like to kick it off and just sort of walk us through the advertising ecosystem at large.
Sure, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I was asked in 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes, to summarize what's going on in the digital ad marketplace. So I've got some key points to share with you. If you look across our membership of DCN, which you should know is about 80 premium publishers, it includes television companies, newspaper companies, magazine companies, and about 20 pure play digital companies. So really the entire news and entertainment ecosystem, from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, to Atlantic Media, CBS, ESPN, et cetera. About the question of how important is advertising, about 80% of the revenues for these digital publishers comes from advertising. Put that against Google. Google's about a little under 90% of their revenue comes from advertising. Facebook is about 98% advertising, so entirely advertising. So advertising is super important. What's happened to the advertising marketplace in digital over the last 2 decades? It's always involved automation. In the beginning, it was a computer serving an ad back in the 90s. But now, most of the entire supply chain of digital advertising is automated. We've gone to a world now where the buying, the transacting, the bidding, the selling is happening without any human involvement for the most part. Google and Facebook are by far the two largest, what we call programmatic marketplaces that leverage automation. Automation is a good thing. It unlocks capital, it creates efficiencies. So this isn't necessarily a bad development, but with it and the way digital advertising has developed over the last 10 years, we've gone to a world that's a giant patchwork of thousands of ad technology companies and intermediaries that are delivering this advertising, and really without any rules of operation. And then you've got Google and Facebook who basically do it all. In terms of what is the real problem here, I'd say there are three issues. One, there's a massive concentration of who's benefiting from digital advertising. DCN did the original analysis 2 years ago on what's been called the duopoly. We used that word for the first time. 85 to 90% of the growth in digital advertising is going to Google and Facebook. So in a $100 billion US digital ad marketplace, 85 to 90% of the growth is just going to Google and Facebook. And even if you bring in all the offline world, television, print, the entirety of the growth in the US advertising market is going to Google and Facebook if you look at the incremental amount. So why? These two companies are able to collect data in a way that no one else can. Data is a source of their power. The digital ad marketplace is built around micro-targeting individual users and audiences wherever they are as cheaply as possible. Google has tracking tags where they collect data on you across around 75% of the top 1 million websites. So essentially anything anyone does in this room across the web, Google sees it, and they're able to collect data to target ads against you. Facebook just disclosed a few weeks ago that they have tracking tags on over 8 million websites. That was a part of the most recent hearing. So 8 million websites, Facebook sees your browsing and what you're doing. So of course, they're winning. Intermediaries, the companies that sit in the middle, are also affecting advertisers. So there's real harm to advertisers that hasn't really been talked about. If you think about a marketplace where the middle is very opaque, and they're all for-profit companies, and they're trying to capture as much value as possible, that welfare comes from the principals. So the advertisers on one side, the users on the other, are being squeezed so that the intermediaries, Google, Facebook, and the ad tech companies can make as much money as possible. And then finally, I'll leave you with probably the most important and least discussed issue, though I've heard a little bit about it this morning, is that Google can operate this marketplace in which they are the dominant player in every stage of the market. So the buying of the advertising, they have a company called DBM, a product called DBM, DCM, which is a product that allows the advertisers to set up their campaigns, DFP, which is a product that nearly all of our publishers have to use to really be successful, which is the serving of the ads, and the actual transactions. Google also measures whether or not the ads are being served and delivered, and they create most of the inventory because they have a monopoly in search, Android operating system, and then the most dominant browser. In any other marketplace, this would be illegal without regulation. But it's not, because the argument is that the products and the content is free, so therefore it can't be harmful to consumers. It's certainly harmful to competition. So we find ourselves in a reckoning here where the misalignment of who's benefiting from the revenue and the profit of our industry is not aligned with what consumers actually want. It's not aligned with the companies that are creating the high quality news and entertainment. It's leading to issues that bubble up like garbage content, more and more ad blocking where users are saying, I don't want ads altogether. Privacy issues, which we've been talking a lot about recently, that's a real problem. Julia Angwin here was an expert shining a light on this back probably a decade ago. And most important to me, and I imagine a lot of everyone in the room, is it's at odds with what pays for newsrooms and journalists. I just came from Portugal last week, the World News Media Conference. There was over 100 countries represented, over 20,000 journalists and news organizations represented. And when I talked about these issues on stage, and I actually had a private meeting with their board, everyone was nodding their head. Every country in this world is dealing with this issue right now, and the concentration of power coming from two companies that are back here in America, and they're able to operate in the way that they're operating. That's my setup.
Thank you so much, Jason. I want to kick it over to Ben Smith just to talk a little bit about what does this mean if you're actually on the publishing side? Is this market power actually straining media companies in the same way that you're experiencing? Do you have any optimistic experiences working with these types of companies? Sort of walk us through what it's like as a publisher. Thanks,
Sarah. Yeah, and I realized sort of looking at the composition of this panel that I'm going to wind up being essentially the spokesman for Facebook here, which is not the position I normally find myself in. But just, BuzzFeed News is a company, we exist, we are a product of this ecosystem. We employ hundreds of journalists based on a business we've built in an ecosystem that I think broadly, I agree with Jason's characterization that there's incredible pressure on publishers, driven in large part by the duopoly. I would also say, though, that just the main transition in the media business and the journalism business over the last 10 years isn't merely about Facebook and Google. There's been this very, very dramatic shift toward social media and particularly toward mobile devices. These are different from newspapers. The business, there are these revolutionary changes to the business, which Google and Facebook have been the most successful companies to capitalize on, but which aren't fundamentally products of those two companies. And the sort of vast changes to the world that particularly publishers live in, I think, are larger even than the two biggest winners. And just also to put in a plug for the present, the publishing industry wasn't so great 10 or 15. There's a tendency to romanticize the glory days of newspapers. I grew up in New York City reading the tabloids, which were always full of lies and sensationalism. Fake news is not some internet phenomenon, and which, by the way, were controlled by a small group of oligarchs. So, I think there's a lot to be said for the, particularly on a national level, flowering of really powerful digital media outlets that do a lot of great journalism. Including the one Julia is building right now. I think I would say that is much less true on a local level, and there's been a sort of really terrifying collapse of local journalism that hasn't seen the kind of replacement the way you've seen nationally. But to speak to the more specific issues, I think any digital publishers, including the ones like us who have been most successful, I think, at navigating this ecosystem, have these very complicated relationships with the platforms who are both essentially our distribution channels and our competitors at the same time. I think that's sort of the core of it. On the advertising side, we compete with them, but we, I think, have been successful by thinking a lot about distribution and by sort of building a news organization around primarily a philosophy of distribution, first of all, and thinking about what kind of stories, what kind of content your audience is going to share on the networks that they are spending their lives on. And I think for me, what that meant, coming to BuzzFeed, just to sort of be concrete about it, when I got to BuzzFeed in 2011, it was seen as the world's leading cat website, accurately. I hope we still maintain that distinction. And it took me a minute to understand why Jonah Peretti, the founder of the place, was trying to lure a political reporter from Politico to come work for this, very entertaining but definitely not journalistic website. And the answer was that, they had been spending their time thinking, what will people share on Facebook? And at that moment, the answer was cute animals. And I had spent my time less explicitly thinking about what will people share on Twitter. Like every other political reporter in the country, I was obsessed with Twitter. And the answer to that question was scoops and original reporting and investigations and news. And that's great. That's exactly the right incentives for reporters. And so while the content was very diverse, the sort of core philosophy was how do you was that your audience isn't going primarily to your website, isn't going first of all to your app. And again, that is a feature of the landscape and of consumer choice. I don't think that is a product of decisions made by Google and Facebook, though they primarily benefit. And then the challenge for somebody in the news business is how do you do stories that will punch through on those platforms? And the answer is often you get great scoops, you do great journalism. And so I think on the journalistic side, there's been a lot of benefit. And I guess I am an optimist. I think the current ecosystem the advertising ecosystem, it's hard to, it's I think basically unsustainable. And I think the reason for optimism is that, I think that the platforms may not have realized this yet, but that our interests are fundamentally aligned, that Facebook is not serving its consumers well, and it obviously has recognized that and knows that when the newsfeed is full of lies and sensationalism, and it is existential for them to find a way to have quality media, quality news, and quality entertainment in their feed. And the main remedy in the industry right now is a shift towards subscription, which is to essentially pull content out of these networks and to try to break their news feeds by pulling content away, which is, I think, pretty effective. And if they can't find a way to fund quality, free journalism that appears in those feeds, I do think that that's going to be a huge challenge for them going forward as well.
So Ben, it sounds like for both the platforms and for a publisher like BuzzFeed, there's sort of a mutually assured destruction if you're not ensuring that both are working together to distribute the content.
Well, I think that they need us more than they like to recognize.
And Julia, you've been studying this for a very long time. Walk us through this cycle of information and how it's flowing, and how these sort of market dynamics are affecting what readers are seeing on a day-to-day basis.
Sure. Is this on? No.
You gotta get up close.
Okay, now let me just bring this very close to myself. So I'm going to start a little bit just telling you a little bit about myself. I grew up in the technology industry. I grew up in Palo Alto. I learned to code in 5th grade. I was planning to work in the tech industry. I studied math and computer science, and I fell off because I fell in love with journalism, and but eventually became a tech reporter because I was the only person in the newsroom who knew anything about tech at wherever newsroom I was at. And so eventually, in about 2008 or 9, I was at the Wall Street Journal as a tech reporter, and I noticed this strange phenomenon that all of the companies that I'd grown up covering, they didn't sell products anymore, right? They actually just offered free services. And I grew up in a world where I begged my parents to take me to Fry's computer store and buy software, and it was in a box, shrink wrapped on the shelf, right? And it cost $60. And it was a big deal to buy that software. And I actually spent my weekends helping my parents. Both of them had software startups of some kind, doing QA testing, because you couldn't release a product until actually you tested it a whole bunch, which is a concept that I know is impossible to imagine now. Because we are all, by the way, just in case you were wondering, we are all the QA department for those companies. So anyways, in 2008, 2009, I'm a tech reporter, and I noticed, like, wow, there's this weird shift, right? They're not selling things anymore, so how are they making the money? And so I launched this investigative series called What They Know about generally the idea of this data business, right? The idea that we were being sort of, our data was being collected and monetized by all sorts of companies, Google, Facebook, and all sorts of other ones you've never heard of. And at the time, for people not in the industry, it was very revealing, and people inside the industry were like, whatever, everybody knows that. But the truth is that I think I underestimated, and we probably all underestimated the threat, because at the time it seemed like the threat was like creepy ads, or maybe the government was going to get that data to track you. But what it really was, that development of that business model was the defunding of newspapers. And the reason is because the Wall Street Journal, where I worked, the way they made their money was they had a monopoly on white dudes with BMWs who golfed, right? And like that was only, you want to reach those guys, that's how you got it. And so that was how they had premium prices. Well, all of a sudden, if you could track everyone around the internet, you can find that guy wherever he is, and probably on a lesser quality website. And in fact, what advertisers realized was those guys were a little more distractible when they weren't absorbed in a fantastic news article. And so it was actually kind of better to do it on a cheaper website, and they might click on your ad or notice it more. And so basically the surveillance economy of advertising was in directly one of the major reasons, right, that newspapers couldn't fund their online news operations, or any of their news operations, right? And it's worth noting that right now, out of the top 100 websites in the world, there's only really 2 news properties that I know of, New York Times and ESPN, and neither one of them can support their news operations with their online ad revenues, right? So even if you're at the very top of the pack, it is not something that you can do. Now, you guys probably are doing it because you don't have printing plants or something, but even so, I think it's worth pointing out that like as this shift happened, what happened to me particularly as an investigative journalist is investigative journalism, most expensive piece of the newsroom, investigations that take months, years, that part got squeezed. And so the editor-in-chief of Wall Street Journal actually left to found ProPublica because he saw this change coming. And I went and joined him in 2010. I worked there for the past 4 years. I'm actually just left ProPublica to found a new nonprofit newsroom focused entirely on studying the impact of technology on society. I think there should be at least one sort of niche watchdog organization like that. But I think it's worth noting what's happened in that time. So since the surveillance model came into full force, what's happened is journalism, as you may have noticed, has collapsed, right? The revenues have collapsed. And what we see as a culture of most journalism is hot takes. There's a huge pile-on of everyone writing the same story. And these are all attempts to game the algorithm. Essentially, journalism has become a game of how to game the algorithm, as opposed to what is the news that you would need to do. So the pile-on, it's like I can make a wittier headline for the same story, and all 500 news outlets are writing the same story, when in fact it would be really much better if some of them were covering local issues or school boards. Then you have the gaming of the long tail, which is like, when you do, you hear these stories about like how white nationalists have owned a certain term, right? And so whenever you search on maybe something, they've made all the content for those things. So you see the gaming of the tail by news organizations and by advocacy groups. And then you really see the thing that I think is most disturbing is the outsourcing of trust to the tech companies. So essentially, we as the news business have said, you know what? The tech companies are going to get to decide what is the trustworthy news. They get to rank it, they get to sort it, they get to tell you what's the most important thing. Now, it might be, as you said, Ben, it's not entirely true that those rooms of largely white men who made those decisions for the front pages of the newspapers were always right, but at least there was some intentionality to that, right? And now we have just chosen as a society to say, you know what, I'm sure some algorithm will figure this out. And what's happened is the gaming of the algorithm has become largely the news business. And I think that's a great tragedy for the public and for what they see as news.
I mean, Julia, you just painted a pretty grim picture.
I'm sorry. I'm very optimistic despite being grim.
But it's good that we all have it laid out. And I mean, one of the big questions that I get all the time, especially from people who aren't so steeped in this business, is how did we get here? For some people, it seemed like it happened overnight. And Lena's a good person to have on the panel today because you can provide sort of a little bit more of a nuanced perspective. Some people would say that this was not an inevitable conclusion to news consumption and that there were some regulatory failures or some regulatory decisions that may have led us to a point where we have two very dominant forces. Lena, can you walk us through how we got here and what you see the landscape is evolving towards based off of the regulatory decisions that we've made?
Sure. So I think when talking about Facebook and Google, there's oftentimes a sense that there were these like fantastic new technologies that arrived, and it was just through sheer virtue of their superior products that they were able to acquire so much power. And yes, the amount of power that they enjoy today might be problematic in all these ways, but it's really, the power is entirely a reflection of their success in the marketplace. And I guess just to complicate that narrative a little bit, there have been key instances where both Google and Facebook have, engaged in practices that have a very distinct anti-competitive flavor. They both have built their dominance in part through acquisitions. So Jason was describing how Google has vertically integrated the entire digital ad system. That was in part built through acquisition, through acquiring AdMob, through acquiring DoubleClick. The FTC reviewed the DoubleClick purchase and permitted it. There was a really great dissent by Pamela Jones-Harbor, who was a commissioner at the time, where she noted that the data that Google would be acquiring through this acquisition would really help exacerbate the network effects and help tilt the market, which is exactly what we ended up seeing happen. Google was also the subject of the FTC investigation a few years ago. It was being investigated for search bias, for scraping, for exclusionary contracts. The FTC staff found that Google had violated the antitrust laws on 3 counts. These are all somewhat distinct markets and distinct practices, but because Google has such vertical control over the distribution, the power that it acquires in one market really feeds into other markets because of the data that it's collecting. Similarly with Facebook, Facebook acquired WhatsApp, it acquired Instagram, it acquired Onavo, which is this VPN server, which now acts as this internal spy machine. So VPN, Onavo is this VPN server that in theory is allowing users to have more privacy, but what it also allows Facebook to do is to track in very close detail which rival applications are diverting attention from Facebook. And it's able to use that information to then, identify at the very earliest stages which companies could be potential competitors and go out and acquire them or just offer direct replicas of their services and squeeze them out. So this is now a pattern. And so I think, the information asymmetries between Facebook and even, say, the FTC are such that, it's become very difficult to really ensure that it's not squashing competition. That said, I do think that there were key decisions by the FTC, decisions not to pursue the FTC case, decisions to allow certain, WhatsApp and the Instagram mergers that have really led us to where we are today. I guess I'll just also say that I think as Google and Facebook are now in the process of implementing privacy reforms, implementing reforms to make their platforms more transparent, we're again seeing the power that they wield over publishers in a new way. Google's interpretation and implementation of GDPR is basically, has the power to be make or break for all these publishers. And so, you have GDPR as the regulation, but now you have Google as kind of a quasi-regulator that's now, implementing it. And so I think that, we're really seeing the kind of governance-like power that both Google and Facebook have over the entities that are dependent on their networks. I'll just say also that, historically we've seen analogous moves in trends in the media space, from Jay Gould, who kind of rolled up control over news and media markets. And each time, we've had a strong government response. There's a really strong set of tools, of competition tools, the government has used to ensure that we have a market structure that's really conducive to a strong, independent, free press. Traditionally that's been funded through advertising, and I think, there are ways that government could again ensure that these markets are serving the journalists and serving the public while also, being financially viable.
So when you mentioned some of those acquisitions, say Facebook with Instagram or WhatsApp, can you walk us through why is it that regulators sort of missed the opportunity in understanding why those properties would be so valuable? I mean, at the time, I don't believe WhatsApp was even profitable. So,
Still isn't.
So what's the reason that it was missed? Do you think?
So with Instagram, for example, there was a sense that they weren't even direct competitors because Instagram, had this camera feature, you were doing pictures, and so I think there was just some naivete about how actually, Instagram would help Facebook expand its power over the social networking space. I think with WhatsApp, there were direct promises that Facebook made around, keeping certain data separate, ensuring that the WhatsApp acquisition would not be used in such a way to enhance Facebook's power overall. So I think, these are new issues for enforcers, and I think especially in the US, enforcers have been a little bit slow to fully recognize the way in which acquisition of data can be anti-competitive, and the kind of huge ways in which data acquisition can tilt markets. I think we're at a stage where I think enforcers are a lot more aware of that, and there have been a couple of mergers where the Justice Department reviewed a merger in kind of agriculture technology, for example, a few years ago, where they recognized that data can be acquisition of huge data sets can create huge barriers to entry. So I think we're hopefully going to get there. I think a lot of it also comes down to enforcement will and philosophy. So, sometimes these are not very easy cases to bring, and you have to kind of draw analogies, show how the current facts fit old patterns. But I think, a lot of it does come down to enforcement philosophy. The Microsoft case, for example, was not a slam dunk when it was brought. So I think hopefully, we have a new slate at the FTC. It's a historic moment. We've never before seen 5 new commissioners all come in at the same time. So I think there's an opportunity to really do a lot in this space, but we'll see if it happens.
And there's an opportunity for groups like Open Markets to continue to educate new players in this space about the threats that are happening. Jonathan, I want to pivot over to you. I heard 2 points today that I thought were very applicable to some of the work that you do. One is that Jason was mentioning that there's this sort of squeeze where you have the brands, the people who are spending money on advertising, and the publishers and all the middlemen in between them. And the other is what Julia was saying about how data is becoming so targeted that you're able to reach new users. How have these two concepts affected the way that brands reach different people with advertising? Are we still trying to get to a certain or particular person via certain content? Do we care about their demographics? What does this look like if you're a marketer?
Sure. So one of the biggest challenges is in looking at these digital advertising markets, there's a tendency to try to take the offline world and import it into the online world. And in the offline world, it was pretty simple, right? Some folks have described it. You build a newspaper, that newspaper or publication attracts a demographic, and then you hire a sales force. That sales force goes out and says, we have a great publication, here's our demographic, we're producing great content, we're going to continue to produce great content, you're going to want your ad alongside our content. Makes sense. There is this assumption that that transfers to the online world, and it did very early on. So when you first had this shift to the online world, websites, publishers would put news or other information up, and they go hire a sales force, and that sales force would go out and say, you want to have your advertising next to my content. And that made sense for a while until volume started to increase exponentially, and a lot of information was being, paid views are being wasted, targeting started to improve, so you didn't have to necessarily rely on the content itself, but you can rely on targeting to the individual. Then what happened is, a shift from really a model that's built around what you might imagine your old advertising ecosystem to look like, to something that resembles, and frankly pretty closely resembles, a commodities exchange, right? These are now marketplaces, buyers and sellers and exchanges who come in the middle and who buy in bulk commodities, people, impressions, right? And so what happens is you no longer, as an advertiser, have a relationship with the publisher. You're buying the person, right? I don't go and say I'm buying the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. I'm buying Julia. I don't care where I see her, right? I want to buy her 5 times.
Do you think that affects the advertising effectiveness and experience?
Absolutely, it affects the advertising effectiveness as an experience, because there's this assumption that so long as Julia is seeing the ad and you induce the click, it's a good experience. That's not always a good experience. There's value in being seen next to a brand. The other problem is we have centralized control of those ecosystems, right? Because what you're doing now is you're gathering lots of people in one marketplace and you're slicing and dicing and selling them using data and targeting. And when all of that takes place in one spot, right, that creates a bottleneck. That creates a lot of control. And one of the things that happens is now, in case, let's say for Google, I can't go out and sell my own targeted ads, even as a large publisher, because I can't attract enough visitors. So I have 2 choices. One choice is I can use a subscription service, in which case for at least 10 years I would get dinged on the search results if I did that. Or I can use advertising, in which case I have to outsource and use that that exchange marketplace because I don't have enough users to slice and dice to sell all my ads. So what happens? Well, in the case of a new publisher or a big publisher, I'm outsourcing to DoubleClick. DoubleClick basically takes the person who visits it, auctions it off. They own the ad server that identifies Julia, that figures out where you want to sell Julia. They own the exchange where you exchange Julia, and they own the demand side platform that the advertiser uses to buy Julia. And they programmatically adjust the prices on their own. And guess what? They didn't build all these products organically. They acquired them, just as Lena said. So you go back to DoubleClick in 2007, these are exactly the concerns that people raised. They said if one company controls the buy side and the sell side in the exchange, then they're going to be able to manipulate the market, just like a commodities exchange. They're going to be able to funnel products into their own services and exclude rivals. The FTC said, no, you don't have to worry about it for two reasons. One, you have this really great company called AOL that's going to keep everyone honest, and this other really great company called Yahoo that's going to keep everyone honest. Oh, by the way, if they engage in any of those practices, we'll act swiftly. Well, it's 11 years later, and I'm still waiting for the FTC to act swiftly. Then there were the dominant mobile ad servers, or mobile advertising network, AdMob. Google and AdMob were number two. They were going to essentially merge to virtually a monopoly. The FTC got close to blocking that deal, and a company called Apple bought a company called Quattro, a small mobile provider. FTC said, oh, it's okay, you don't have to worry about the AdMob deal because of Apple. Apple's surely going to succeed with a product called iAd. Who here has heard of iAd? How much ad revenue does iAd have? Julia? Right. And so now there was a merger of monopoly. They got it wrong. The DOJ reviewed the acquisition by Google of a company called AdMeld, right? The largest demand-side platform that represents the buyers. DOJ investigated that for 6 months and said, it's okay, you don't need to worry about the merger from the owning the largest publisher, the largest advertiser buying the largest demand-side platform because ad networks. So it's all right, you can let AdMeld through. Julia, is an ad network a substitute for demand-side platform? Yes or no?
No.
Right. And so now you have this end-to-end ad tech stack, and you have not only one company managing the buyers and sellers and owning the exchange and able to manipulate the market in real time. Guess what? They buy and sell on their own exchange. If this were a commodity overseen by the CFTC, it would be a vastly different situation. And so one of the challenges, it's a failure of antitrust enforcement, but it's also a failure of understanding how these markets work and the reality of these markets and taking these offline, simplistic points of view that AOL, Yahoo, iAd, and ad networks are going to keep the market honest when that was never going to happen because the market wasn't evolving in that fashion.
I'm going to push this to Julia. There has been a sort of resurgence in some of the telecom companies wanting to get into advertising. And we saw there was a law passed, signed in 2017 that said telecom companies can now sell data to third parties. The ruling was, or the law was passed with the understanding that this would allow them to compete with some of the new age tech companies like a Google or a Facebook. But, and Jason, I know you and I talk about this all the time, Google and Facebook endorsed that. Google and Facebook saw this as an opportunity for them to be able to sell sort of similar, like-minded data. Now we're seeing those types of companies are getting into similar games with, you know, OTT content and long-form video. What do you see the landscape shifting like with regards to the telecoms now being sort of empowered a little bit by deregulation? Are they going to actually be able to take on some of these companies, or is it just too far down the road?
It's hard to say. You know, I hate to say never, because I remember when I was a tech reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle, and I had seen like 100 different search engines come through. So when Google showed up, I was like, I didn't even take a meeting because I was like, whatever, there's so many search engines out there. So I am terrible at predictions. But I will say that the telecoms, I find it so amazing, right? We pay them enormous amounts of money every month for kind of crappy service, to be honest, right? Like definitely not comparable to other Western broadband, you know, with the way broadband works in most of the Western world, where they have much better speeds. And so we pay them an enormous amount, and then they were like, oh, that's not enough, we want to sell your data too. And you know, Verizon and AT&T now have the ability to, and do sell like your location on your phone as you walk around. They actually allow for advertisers to target you in ways that are just incredibly creepy and invasive, because location is really the most revealing piece of information about you. You can try to take all steps to mask your identity, but it turns out there's a study from Microsoft that 4 distinct locations throughout the day are enough to uniquely identify you. So you're the only person who goes to your home, your work, and whatever the coffee shop that you always go to. So I think that the telecom incursion in there is, it feels unfair, like as a person who's already paying them, but I actually have to say that they are not succeeding at breaking up the Facebook and Google monopoly on advertising right now. And I guess I just want to throw in a little bit of the thing I'm most worried about right now is actually something like that the companies would probably call mass customization, but I would call mass discrimination, which is essentially the ability to slice and dice audiences by such fine-grained things and such behaviors that are revealed, that are not stated. So, for instance, Facebook has assigned you a racial category. They based on your behavior. You don't ever say to them, "I am of this race" or not, and then allows advertisers to target ads on this. And so, the past year, I've been writing extensively about the fact that they were allowing housing ads to be targeted, so that the advertiser could choose to actually block anyone from a certain race from seeing those ads, right? So that meant that you could buy a housing ad and say never show it to a black person, right? Which is literally what the Fair Housing Act was written to prevent from happening. And that case is in litigation right now, and I think there's a question actually about whether Facebook has to comply with the law because they have the special immunity, Section 230, for online content that might imply that they don't actually have to comply with these civil rights laws. And so to me, the targeted advertising ecosystem, although the telecoms are getting in, and I'm sure they would love to be just as discriminatory if they could, is so terrifying from the point of view of undermining a lot, and we've seen this with Russia, right? They could prey on people who'd be most vulnerable to these sort of really divisive messages, and that to me is one of the most scariest civic consequences of this market.
Ben Smith, BuzzFeed is getting into over-the-top video, long-form video, and you're working with certain distribution partners like Netflix. What do you think those companies, are they going to be able to take on some of the Google and Facebooks in the quality of long-form video content, or do you think that Google and Facebook have a long way to go with their Watch and sort of YouTube subscription products?
Let's see. I mean, it's interesting. It's such a complicated business, right? We just moved totally out of the advertising conversation into this parallel universe of subscription, which is HBO and Netflix. We have a Netflix show coming this summer. We have a show on Twitter, and we're talking about other over-the-top stuff. So, and I guess I think that if you look back over the last couple years, it is obvious that Game of Thrones is winning, that Netflix is winning, that the platforms who thought that they could go, that either that sort of social video, kind of quick, cheap video, which I love and think is often a good way to deliver news, was going to compete with Game of Thrones. Just, I think, observationally, turns out to have been a mistake. The notion that you could have a subscription service that was 2 inches up market from YouTube, rather than and that was going to compete with an HBO or a Netflix, I think, again, observationally, seems not to have worked out. But I do think, I guess my own view on this is that for publishers to succeed in these spaces, you've got to figure out both a traditional production business like the Netflix business, where you're making content and selling it, which is and I think if you look at the great media companies of the 20th century, that was one of the businesses they were in. But you also need to figure out what the advertising business is in that space, because the advertising business, which we have all spent a decade in varying degrees really worrying about, ultimately has the potential to be a much higher margin business, and at its best has been this business that has fueled incredible booms in the publishing industry. So I do think that the thing that is just developing now, and that we are actually find very exciting, and that hopefully can kind of come to with the lessons of the web advertising business, is what that is. We have a morning show on Twitter. We do advertising that both is totally independent of the journalism, and I think because we got to build it from scratch on these new platforms, is a lot more satisfying than a display ad. And is distributed inside Twitter's Amplify system. And that's a system we feel good about, but it does feel like we're at the very beginning of figuring out what that ecosystem looks like. And I do think there'll be a lot of it'll be worth looking at all the choices publishers made and mistakes over the last 15 years as we sort of head into that ecosystem. And I think Twitter, Facebook, Google are very much figuring out right now what advertising looks like inside OTT.
Yep. And I mean, just speaking to that, last night I interviewed Facebook's Campbell Brown, and she said that for now they're going to be paying news publishers to create watch video, but eventually they hope to migrate off of that model and to instead create an ad-supported version of watch so that news publishers could have a sustainable route to monetization through news shows. Jason Kint, what do you make of that news? Do you think that's actually going to happen? We've seen things with Facebook Live, for example, where Facebook came in and paid publishers to create live video, and then as soon as Facebook sort of let the publishers go and monetize themselves, the platform sort of fell apart. So my question is, do you trust that that's going to work? And then the other thing I'd love to hear from you is, we're seeing some of the platforms now are trying to take responsibility for defining which news organizations are valid or credible. We're seeing this with some of Facebook's decisions around how it's going to archive ads for political content for news organizations. What do you make of that?
Sure. Thank you. On the first question, Facebook funding video for watch. It's interesting. Every 6 months or every year, Facebook and Google does this and Apple does this too. So I shouldn't pick on Facebook. They do a big announcement and they win favor with some of the most premium brands. They want to lead these announcements with companies like Buzzfeed, New York Times, ESPN, et cetera. But ultimately, over time, it doesn't work out. And so, fool me once, fool me twice. But there's a long history of this, and we study it. I'll tell you what I told Facebook and Campbell Brown, and I'm not breaking any confidentiality here from her side, but I said, you have a global policy war right now and trust issue as a company, and you're not getting out of it right now based on the way you're reacting as a company. This is only going to get worse, and the only way you're going to kind of buy some time is walking up with a boatload of cash to try to win favor with publishers, and that seems to be what they're doing. I think they're writing a check, taking out their checkbook to pay for a production of a bunch of content. Google famously did that in Europe with something called the Digital News Initiative, and I think it bought them a few years. But ultimately, we have to fix the model, and I don't think this little experiment with Watch is going to change anything long term. To your second question, it's kind of nuanced, but it's super concerning to news publishers globally, and I'll give credit to Danielle Coffey over at News Media Alliance, who really did a great job of getting news organizations around the world to understand this issue and why it should be so concerning. We sent a letter to Facebook yesterday on behalf of 7 associations. What they're doing is they're actually, in the spirit of transparency, which put aside how rich it is for Facebook to be talking about transparency, they're actually taking legitimate news content from the New York Times, from PBS, from the Financial Times, and if they determine it's political or issue related, they're putting it into a political ad archive, along with campaign ads, PACs, et cetera. Real world example, free Memorial Day concert streamed over PBS last weekend because it was promoted on Facebook, ended up in this political ad archive. That is outrageous to me, and it needs to change. And Facebook has been unwilling to actually even engage with associations over this issue. And they're saying that they're figuring out with publishers, but really what they're doing is they're evolving their story over the last few weeks, and they're scrambling. I just gave you a long version of what I heard, if you don't mind, Julia, what you described this as in one word when I told her about it this morning. What was the word you used?
I don't know if I should say.
Okay.
No, I said garbage.
Garbage.
Yeah, I mean, basically the political ad classification system that Facebook has developed is, the best way to describe it is it's at very early stages, right? And so it's over capturing in certain ways and then under capturing in other ways, and it's not at all finely tuned. And I can say that because I built at ProPublica a tool where we've been capturing political ads and using machine learning to adjust our idea of what is a political advertisement, and so I have a corpus of political ads I can compare to the ones that Facebook has labeled as political, and it's just it's very early, and I think that it's really harmful to not just publishers, but I was just speaking to some immigrant rights groups who are finding that they want to deliver services to immigrants, but everything that says the word immigrant is being classified as a political ad, which means that they have to go through some extra steps to buy the ad and more verification, and so it's really clunky right now, this effort at transparency, and it's not clear right now whether that's doing more harm than good.
We have just a few minutes left, so we probably have time for 1, maybe 2 questions from the audience if anyone would like to pose a question.
I'd just like to throw out the question of Section 230 and just have you guys talk about that a little bit.
And your name and organization?
Bill Densmore, the Information Trust Exchange Governing Association.
Thank you.
I'll do Section 230.
I heard you say, oh yes.
I know. I love Section 230. So maybe not everybody knows what Section 230 is. So just essentially, it's a immunity that was granted to the tech companies in the 1996 Telecom Reform Act, and gave them the fact they are not liable for third-party content published on their websites. And so that essentially means that, if for instance, the Wall Street Journal published something that was illegal in their pages, like a housing ad that was discriminatory, or a libelous news article, like that is an existential legal risk for the Wall Street Journal as a publisher. But for Facebook, if it hosts content like that written by somebody else, so somebody writes lies and libelous content, or places ads that are discriminatory and break the civil rights laws, it's not clear whether the law basically gives them exemption from liability for those things. And so what that means on a practical level is that that's true for all the tech companies. So what that means is that although Facebook has pledged to put 20,000 people in charge of moderating and doing better at cleaning up its site, the truth is that because every one of them has this immunity, there's no incentive to spend too much money policing, because your competitors are not going to spend that money, right? So it's like a level set where you would have to really cut into sort of the industry-wide profit margins to really address those issues, because they are issues that really are hard to solve with automation. You actually need to have somebody with editorial judgment looking and making a judgment about whether something is libelous or illegal.
And with millions of hours of content uploaded every day, I think it's 400 hours uploaded a minute for YouTube, it becomes really hard to police that. Jonathan, do you have any thoughts? I see you peeking at the...
No.
Okay. Does anybody else have, I think we have time for one final question. Gene Killerman?
So you've challenged antitrust, I think, appropriately for missing a lot of issues. You've challenged the entire publishing and media industry for missing understanding its own business model and advertising. That's an industry that did this 10, 20, and 30 years ago, calling for elimination of media ownership rules, calling for changes in copyright law to protect themselves, and run by a lot of old oligarchs from right and left. So what I heard you say was advertising has just been transformed by the digital economy. And maybe nobody predicted it well. And no enforcers did it well, and no industry challenged the tech companies well. But I haven't heard any solutions other than go back and enrich the old rather than the new. Go back to publishers who I think had a million problems in serving democracy and diversity instead of the current tech titans. So it seems to me with the problems of whether Facebook is doing a good job or Google is trying to get the monkey off its back, shouldn't there be some independent third-party entity, like a ProPublica kind of operation? Shouldn't there be somebody who can develop a product that helps us discern what is fact from fiction, what is machine from human, what is opinion from well-researched information, and actually market it? And possibly the intermediary protections should be dependent upon using products like that so that you're actually, as a platform, informing the public. And if you don't want to do that, then maybe you shouldn't get those kind of immunities. Shouldn't we be looking for those kinds of solutions?
So may I take that, because it's an important question, which is what do you do now, right? And we can all agree and disagree about where the blame lies, or maybe we don't. But I would start by saying I think first place would be ideally a market-based solution, right? And so a market-based solution doesn't necessarily have to mean models of old, thriving in the world of new. It can mean new models. It can mean disruption. It can mean digital-only platforms that are able to thrive with an ad-based model. But part of the challenge is we're not going to see those market-based solutions emerge unless we kind of undo that clog on competition that sits in the middle with the intermediary. And so part of what's necessary is for people to understand how these markets work. I think there's an education gap at the enforcement agencies in terms of understanding how this really functions. Second is there is anti-competitive conduct, at least in my view, that's taking place but going unaddressed. And it's persistent. And if you don't use the antitrust laws, if you're not enforcing then there's no deterrent. And these clogs on competition will continue to exist because there are no penalties, there are no repercussions for behaving badly. And so the rules of the road have been set, and what needs to happen now is they need to be reset. And we need to have a new discussion about what those rules of the road should be in light of how the markets work. We need to talk about a positive future, one that allows markets to thrive, right? And not just new players, not just existing players, including the intermediaries. They should be able to compete and thrive and innovate. But I personally, and I think a lot of people in this room, right, left, or center, agree that competition can induce the kind of benefits of trustworthiness, of accuracy, of diversity of viewpoints and voices, of price, of advertising opportunities. And in the lack of that competition, we're going to continue to struggle the way we are, and everyone's going to continue writing their news to meet the search engine optimization requirements, as opposed to because they can drive demand to their publisher.
Jason, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
I think he covered it really well, and I think it's super important to pay for the great work you're doing and the two other journalists down at the other end of the table.
We just have about one question left. If anyone has one, I see a hand over here.
Peter Selman with Capital Intelligence. My question is sort of the irony is us, old media, legacy media, face antitrust and legal concerns if we got together and created our own platform to replace Facebook and Google, while Google and Facebook and Twitter seems to get away with murder. How can we do this? Because we got new technology like blockchain that will replace all this old, new media is now old media is now new media. How do we get around this issue of antitrust? We get busted for cartel action while they get away with whatever they're doing.
I'll jump. I mean, that irony hits me all the time, and especially when we think about news, which they're, ultimately is a consumer good there. So the fact that antitrust law gets in the way of trying to compete with antitrust violations.
But Jason will be hosting a secret meeting in the gender-neutral bathroom.
No, but
for anybody who wants to
as
do
the
media
antitrust lawyer in
executives
the
after
room,
this.
I advise against that.
Yeah.
Representative Cicilline a few months ago introduced a bill that would allow kind of news publishers to kind of collectively try to bargain with the platforms. I think generally it's better not to introduce more exemptions and immunities from the antitrust laws, and the better task would be to actually enforce the current laws we have to address the market power problems, rather than kind of ratify this model of kind of big versus big.
If I can amplify one other thing, because I heard the word blockchain, and there's lots of interesting opportunity there, and I saw lots of presentations on again last week. Having spent 22 years in digital media, I have watched every year the next thing become part of the discussion, and I've had discussions with enforcers who have said, but things are going to change in mobile. Well, Google has 85% of the mobile operating system market. So, but we've seen this time and time, from we call branded content to programmatic. Ad networks will take care of this, and Jonathan went down part of the litany too. Be very, very careful. The next thing around the corner next year, and blockchain is not suddenly going to solve these issues. Blockchain is just another building block, if you will, no pun intended.
This has all been incredibly helpful. I want to thank the folks at Open Markets Institute for having us. And just to kind of quickly recap, we've had one of the most enlightening hours around this sort of topic. To go through some of the things we learned today, Jason shared that Facebook is tracking 8 million websites across the digital ecosystem, which is a pretty extraordinary number. One of the things that stuck out to me from Ben is that Google and Facebook are not necessarily synonymous with smartphone and web, rather they're products of those new technologies. Julia was talking about how the telecom companies are not really putting a dent in some of the digital advertising dominance of Google and Facebook. I also liked her comments about the surveillance economy. Lena was talking about how there have been instances in which our regulatory systems have failed, or they've punted on certain decisions which have allowed some of these companies to grow. And then Jonathan, one of the things I thought was really insightful is that we're no longer targeting people by content, we're targeting people by audience and wherever they are at any time. Thank you all again for joining us. Encourage everyone to stay for the rest of the event. Thank you.
Thank you.